Hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my review of Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons Remake. I have hotly been anticipating this, as the original Brothers I think is an absolute timeless classic, a must play. Everyone should play it at some stage, if you fancy yourself a bit of a gamer. So, just to front load and not bait you along, it's kind of with a heavy heart that if you ask me the question, is this game worth your time, is it worth your money? I kind of gotta say no. At least from a money perspective. There's a bit to unpack, so bear with me. First, I will just cover off the way that I review games on this channel. It's a little bit unusual. I have one objective standard that I hold to, which is for every $5 that a game asks of me, I ask it give me an hour of good, clean fun. We've been playing with the idea of doing a score system, and I'm going to separate that out into its own video weekly, so I won't go into that too much here. We're just going with the established method since last year. So in this particular case, the Brothers Remake is going for $29.95 Australian. $30, 6 hours. I breezed through this in 2.5 hours. Now that's not a huge surprise because that's what the original game was like. And you may or may not be aware that this is a one-to-one pretty much remake, remaster, whatever you want to call it. It hasn't been overhauled, not really, not from a gameplay content perspective. So I set that bar, and some people will get in it with me about, whether it should be $1 per hour or whatever. No, the point of the bar is that it gives me enough time with the game to actually pass fair judgment, and it's supposed to be a minimum standard requirement. It's low on purpose. If your game doesn't pass the 5-to-1 conversion, there's a serious conversation to be had about value, especially in a market filled with brilliant games. So this is one of the rare cases where it doesn't come through. Now, is it worth your time? Sure, absolutely. Or at least one of the Brothers versions, if this or the original. The original I looked up actually is still going for like $20 Australian. So I would still argue that it's probably not worth the money either, not at full price, not for what you get, even though it's a wonderful 2.5 hour experience. My advice would be wishlist them both and watch for sales and pick your own price point. The problem is, this is in many ways kind of the inferior of the two. Allow me to unpack. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, and honestly they're interchangeable as far as structure goes. It's a single player game originally where you're controlling these two brothers as they go through this sort of epic high fantasy adventure. And it's evocative of things like Never-Ending Story, for example. And even things like the first Fellowship of the Rings movies. There is this sort of traveling core to it, from humble beginnings into sort of grim, dark world beyond. Don't get me wrong, I still think it's wonderful, and it's definitely something that you should find a way to play, but you have to pick your price point. But the gimmick, the shtick, which, it never, to be honest, it never really held up back in the day, and it doesn't hold up now. It's experimental indie stuff, is where you're controlling two different characters, the two brothers, with two thumbsticks, one each. So it's a bit of a battle between your left brain and your right brain. And all of it's constructed around that, these sort of two-man puzzles, but very explicitly, like I said, the shtick, the hook, the trick is that it's one person trying to grapple with the fact that it's almost like an optical illusion in game form, that you are going to sort of have brain farts as you're trying to platform, and you're going to accidentally drop one and the other. And so to focus in on that, that's what the gameplay loop is. And the gameplay loop isn't exactly the huge part of this. I would argue the story and the world building is. They've put co-op into this version of the game, and to me, it sort of tells you that the guys behind the wheel, and it is a different studio doing the remake, as it often is, they don't actually seem to understand why the first version of this game, the original, was a success in and of its own right. And if you look at the track history of, Farah's the dude that made this, and games that followed, I believe like The Way Out, It Takes Two, I feel like maybe there's a misunderstanding. Maybe they always wanted this game to be a co-op game, but for whatever reason it didn't happen. But the magic of this isn't necessarily that it should be co-op. The magic, if you want to call it that, is that it's an interesting mechanic that kind of works when it's one person's two halves of their brain battling against each other. You make this co-op, and all of a sudden it's just a one thumbstick, one button, incredibly shallow light puzzler. Like, I think you kind of shine a real light on the problems of this game if you do make it co-op. So I don't really know what to feel about that. Obviously, they've made a string of co-op games on the back of this, and I feel like maybe that was driven by either they always wanted this to be co-op or maybe even fan feedback. Oh, I wish this was co-op, but it's be careful what you wish for. So this game was never made to be co-op, and it never really should have been. And, I would argue that's the one big feature that you would be getting from this version if you put money down on it, that you can play it co-op. Though, I would say this is sort of kind of best enjoyed solo, and I'll say it, there is such an idea as the girlfriend game, or whatever you want to call it, your significant other, your partner that doesn't play games but enjoys watching over your shoulder. This game definitely sits in that category, and I know a lot of blokes that's exactly what they do. They play certain games and they're, misso enjoys watching. I feel like you could have just left this alone. There's no need to make it co-op. There's no need to throw a controller in and split an already thin gameplay loop in half and take the actual magic out of it. And without going into spoilers, sort of the big back end act 3 of this game, it revolves around the controls being single player. That's, if you know, that's the most I'll say. So that just boggles my mind. The other thing is, it's obviously had a huge graphical overhaul, and yes, all the environments look beautiful, and that's probably the really big positive in all of this. But they've kind of changed the art direction by scaling up the character models in such a way that they approach an uncanny valley of sorts. I'm not saying they look hyper real, but this game, it doesn't have voiced characters. They all talk in Simlish and exaggerated hand styles and all that. But then all of a sudden now it's pulling in for these tight cinematic camera shots with these faces that look too realistic, too human, that they've moved into a different art style, and it does not match up with the Simlish of it. And in that way, I would say the first game is superior because it has an artistic cohesion that works with the way that the world is unfolded in front of you. And the few times that this game still gets away with it is when, you're interacting with random villagers or whatever, and the camera angle is essentially still pulled out so far that you can't really see the facial details that much, right? So this game, clearly their big work product, which not all work product is of value. If you spend 40 hours making something no one fucking wants, then it's worth nothing. And I think a lot of modern people can't get their head around that. Their real shoot for the moon shot in this game, and what they've done is, try and get those cinematic not hyper realistic, but sort of high fidelity graphics in the facial animations and pull in, but then they've still got the Simlish coming out of their mouth, and they've still got the exaggerated movements. It's a very strange, and if you're sensing a theme, it should be that so much of what they've done here belies that this studio doesn't actually understand what made the original game so magic. So yeah, I guess you could say I'm disappointed. It was nice, broadly the story beats, the game's still intact under the hood, and it was nice to come back to this, being that it is one of those games that I would argue everyone should play at some point. You probably want to get it on sale, and arguably you want to just get the original version. Yeah, I was thinking to myself, I was like, what is the best analogy I could come up with? And it's sort of like if, forget the idea of doing a remake of Half-Life 2 or something, but imagine fully voicing Gordon Freeman. And I feel like some people that don't think more than what they had for breakfast would say that's a good idea. But my immediate reaction is don't fuck with something that's kind of brilliant already. And there's just so much scope to mess it up, right? You don't really want a revisionist version of the Mona Lisa. Not that I'm trying to put all these in the same wheelhouse, but there's something to be said about maybe instead of rolling the dice and fucking up your legacy by doing a remake, maybe just leave something well enough alone. Especially if you're going to make some artistic changes, there is scope that you're going to mess up and miss the mark. And I'm telling you here, everything that they changed, they seem to not understand why this game is good, or at least the original is. Having said that, I'll throw it down another example, because I'm very against remake culture. To me, it is kind of weak and cash grabby and derivative, and at the very least, I look at it and go, why don't you just roll the dice on some original IP? But there have been some absolute bangers. The Resident Evil games are great examples. However, they take the loop and they iterate on it and they try and do something different. And they've done really well, like the Resident Evil 2s especially, being that, they almost changed the entire genre, or at least the camera angle, and it really plays very, very differently as a third-person survival horror as opposed to sort of fixed traditional camera angle. Likewise, you have Dead Space, and I love the original, and the remake was brilliant. And they did, the cardinal sin. They kind of gave Isaac a voice, but they didn't fuck it up. And even then, even now, it's revisionist looking back on it, but I would still say, if you were at the drawing board, the smart money would be, don't do that. Don't give Isaac a voice in Dead Space, because the possibility that you fuck it up versus nailing it is much more likely. So yeah, look, I'm glad it happened. I'm glad it turned out the way it did. But there's just some sort of examples of the pitfalls, the dangers, and the difference between a studio handling the original IP deftly, and it's not necessarily with reverence, but at least with an understanding of what's actually special about it. And it really makes me wonder how involved the original studio and creators were in this remaster, because again, looking at the games that they released, how they really lent into co-op and trying to, it starts to look like maybe they caught lightning in the bottle with Brothers, by accident, and tried to emulate it with their following games, as opposed to having a firm grasp on the magic all along. It is interesting, because nothing they made since Brothers really grabbed me. Anyway, so they're my sort of main takeaways. The environments and all that look really nice. And the stuff that isn't human character model faces pulled up close still looks great as well. They've added a co-op mode and I don't know why, and if anything, it kind of undermines the entire game in the first place. And yeah, they really shot their shot doing these close-up, dramatic facial expression things, and it misses the mark. It really does. And it comes across as jarring more than an actual value add. So yeah, that's my review for Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons remake. Let me know what you reckon. Otherwise, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.